Consciousness became more and more left-brain rational. This was a development that also coincided with more and more patriarchal cultures. More and more of the mysteries connected to the divine feminine and to the yin polarity got more and more taken out. Three essential stages of spiritual discernment that in many modern, very patriarchal systems, they have excluded the knowledge of the column below and working with the centers below. And this will be anything from saying, well, you simply can't do it because those gates have been closed for a long time, to actually saying in some traditions that it's a taboo. It is absolutely forbidden. You're not allowed to connect to the centers below because these are connected to detrimental spiritual beings and forces and black magic, and it's absolutely not permitted. Particularly as this gets into the more rigid and fear-based attitudes toward it, that this comes the more you get into highly patriarchal systems. An essential part of initiation to understand the centers below and to connect to them. And so we're going to clarify some of that, because for the vast majority of people, the clearest angelic and non-physical communication will come in the beginning with crystallizing the consciousness of the centers above the head, because that's the closest to our current center of consciousness, which is in the thinking realm, in our heads. The centers below are also extremely important. They have their own highly advanced functions, and we need to balance going up with the going down. In addition to what we think of in a very common model as the 7 chakras in the body, we also have a series of chakras that run from the trunk down. So from the perineum down to the feet, there's also a series of 7 for a total of 13. There's another thing to clarify about this that's very important. In the school of Daskalos, for example, where they go into a lot of detail about all these things, they talk about creating elementals of angelic beings. Now, we need to be very clear here about something that gets confused in a number of traditions. In some parts of the Western tradition, they will talk about this creation of elementals, and they will confuse a human-created elemental of an angelic being with a true angelic being. And they will present it as, oh, all angelic beings are created in this way. They're all projections of your mind. They don't exist externally. That's not actually the case. This is because they've been trained in a system where they learn the aspect of the elemental creation, but they don't understand about the other aspect. In doing any type of spiritual development, meditative training, that there's a balance between receptive meditation and active meditation. The problem being that in the modern world, most types of meditation taught by different teachers or schools are only one or the other. Meaning that either you're taught a type of emptiness meditation, like Zen or Vipassana or Transcendental meditation, like some Eastern schools, or, on the other hand, you're taught a type of active meditation, like creative visualization. Well, these are two opposite mind powers, and they're both absolutely essential. But the problem is people are being taught today just to develop one side of it. Developing the receptive meditation, where you can clear the mind and perceive what's actually empirically in front of you instead of constantly projecting stuff out, allows you to perceive spiritual realities as they actually are without contaminating them with our own projections. So that's essential. However, the other side is also essential, because what the creative visualization does is it allows us to take action with the mind power. It allows us to craft or create things with the mind power. But if you developed only that side, you would not know if what you're perceiving spiritually is actually present or your own projection. And so for the receptive schools, they develop the capacity to clear the mind and see what's actually present, but they may not develop the capacity to actually take action. The other school develops the capacity to take action, but may not be able to see what's actually empirically present. So these two things have to go together. To be able to perceive higher spiritual beings and not contaminate that with our own projections about them or our own emotional reactions to them requires doing regular receptive meditation to clear the mind, to see what's actually there. So we're not just constantly picking up our own projections. Whereas to develop a beneficial elemental being that we craft, that, for example, can be a healing elemental, as is used in the school of Daskalos, that requires the active meditation. So both these things are essential. And so people that just developed the capacity to develop their own elementals and understood that active side of it, sometimes the school will say, well, you don't have to worry about the actual angelic beings because they don't even exist. They're just all projections of your own mind, because that's all they know. We need to be aware that there's a lot of fragmentary teachings today, and what we're trying to do is trying to bring those pieces back together. So it is entirely possible for us to create our own projected elemental of an angelic being. And again, the School of Dascalos to go into great detail about how you do it and what those different beings may be. Now you'll see illustrations of this in classical medieval work, where you do a meditation, for example, where you would create the 4 archangels in 4 directions around you to seal the 4 directions. And now when you do that, you need to be very aware that what you're doing is you're creating elementals of the archangels. They're not the actual archangels. Archangels are way beyond us. Archangel Michael, you cannot make him do anything. You can ask him for help, and if he likes you, he may come around to help you. But you can't make him do it. You can project an elemental, and it is possible for Archangel Michael to connect his power to that elemental. But that's up to what your own quality is. If you're a black magician, if you've got all kind of weird stuff going on, it's probably not going to want to link to that energy. One way that we sometimes generate, particularly your own quality is, if you're a black magician, if you've got all kind of weird stuff going on, it's probably not going to want to link to that energy. One way that we sometimes generate, particularly mind form elementals, is through the third eye center. And you will see this illustrated in classical mythology with things like spiritual beings that are being born full-blown from the brow of Zeus, for example. That's actually an initiate consciousness illustration of the creation of an elemental being. Every human being is doing it. Just the difference is, do you know you're doing it or not? And what's the quality of that being? So what's often referred to amorphously as thought forms are actually at a deeper level connected to this beingness aspect of the elemental beings. But again, they don't have the whole power of those from the higher hierarchies or the Godhead. Because in a sense, we are the elementals from the Godhead, as are the higher angelic beings. Now, these self-generated elementals that we create, they can affect us negatively if they have a negative form to them, and affect other people negatively. Like if you're in a relationship with a person who's constantly generating negative thoughts, feelings, actions, you know the toll that takes on you. You walk into a room where that's been going on and somebody's generating those thoughts, feelings, or actions, you can feel it when you enter into the room. It has an effect externally. It has an effect on the person because they do it repeatedly. It begins to create a pattern in their subtle bodies. And in modern psychology, we refer to these as neuroses or as psychological complexes, etc. But from an esoteric perspective, they've known about it for thousands of years. And they're the elemental beings that are generated. Or elemental beings from other people can also affect us. And if we're in a relationship with a person, their generated elemental beings can start affecting us in a repeated format that develops these psychological issues with us as well. Children are very susceptible to this, and so if the parents are constantly generating these detrimental elementals all the time with negative thoughts, emotions, etc., the children will start developing the psychological complex based on the constant impact. And then they'll start generating elementals of the same quality. We want to say something about 3 essential stages of spiritual discernment. Now, the first essential stage is that we need to differentiate our conscious self from our reactive self, the reactive mind. This is pretty much Psychology 101 on the metaphysical path today. Whenever people start to do any self-help work, this is what you do. You start to recognize when you're actually fully conscious and have free will versus the times that you've fallen into being triggered into a reactive mind state. And esoterically, many traditions talk about this, like the Gurdjieff work. In the work of Gurdjieff, he's always talking about people being asleep and falling asleep, and that you have to wake up, and that you have to practice what in his school is called particular practices of waking up and self-awareness and self-remembering. So self-remembering in the Gurdjieff school is where you remember to stay awake. You're observing yourself, and you don't just get triggered by somebody's tone of voice or what's going on in your environment to just act out in an animalistic form and not really be fully conscious. This is something that was part of the old mystery schools and has been brought into the modern world today as basic self-help psychology. When am I in a reactive mind state and just acting out my detrimental patterns? And when am I fully conscious and making a free choice? Because when you have an argument with your significant other, you know you can go into your reactive mind state and then it's just like 2 animals tearing at each other. Or you can be fully conscious and choose a more skillful way of responding. So that's the first stage. Everybody can do that. Everybody needs to do that. That's when, again, first things we do in modern metaphysics, which is very good, is basic self-help, self-awareness, self-analysis stuff. Second stage is getting more into the initiation work, and that is to differentiate our self-generated conscious thinking, feeling, and willing from impulses coming from external spiritual beings. And then stage 3 is to differentiate what is the essential nature of the external spiritual being that's currently affecting my internal soul life. Now, stages 2 and 3 really should only be undertaken by persons who have a sufficient level of what we'll call spiritual structure and are fairly internally stable. If a person is already having a lot of psychological issues, they're in psychological medication, things of that kind, they should not enter into stages 2 and 3. And that's because these stages can be very destabilizing for them. Because one of the things that happens for everyone on a path of initiation is you begin to realize that a huge amount, for most people, the vast majority, of our internal life is not consciously self-generated. At the first stage, it's coming from our reactive mind patterns. We're not really conscious that much at all. And at the next level, we become aware of how much of it is actually coming from the influence of external beings. Again, for a person who does not have a good, stable psychological structure, to be aware that a lot of your internal thoughts, feelings, and actions are being triggered in you by an external being and not by yourself is extremely destabilizing. It's true, but nonetheless, not a good thing to focus on if you're highly psychologically unstable. But this is a core part of initiation work. Then, in my next note here, that stage 3, with differentiating the essential natures of the external spiritual being, because at stage 2 we differentiated, is that me generating that thought, feeling, or action? Or did it come from something outside influencing me, with a cord going into my field, or with a being moving through my field? And so being able to differentiate what I generated versus what's coming from the outside, once we can differentiate those two, which usually comes through particular meditative practices, we then will have to differentiate what kinds of beings are affecting us, because some are very true guides, and some maybe are not so dependable. That's why in classical work, like the work of St. Paul in the New Testament, he'll talk about you have to test the spirits, because not every spiritual being that approaches you is necessarily a being that is bringing a beneficial impulse, or a being that knows everything, or that has an agenda that's one we would want to sign on to. So we have to differentiate these beings. That's extremely important. One of the major problems in modern metaphysics is that we lost one of the old keys, which is that you need a minimum 3-fold differentiation of spiritual beings. What happened is it got simplified down to a 2-fold differentiation. There's the good beings, there's the bad beings. Good beings are light, bad beings are dark. That's not enough to differentiate. All kind of people are approached by beings of tremendous light, but that doesn't mean that they're quote-unquote good. We have to change our thoughts about this whole good-bad dichotomy into something that has to do with actual balance. And that means a minimum 3-fold differentiation. And that's what you see in all these classical traditions. For example, you have the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition, where they show you the tree of life. There's the middle pillar on the tree of life. It's the only one that goes all the way up to the top, to Keter, the crown, and all the way down to Malkut, the earth at the bottom. Then there's 2 side pillars. They don't go all the way up and down. One's the pillar of mercy and one's the pillar of severity. 2 opposite polarities, but the balance is in the center. Then you have the concept from the Tibetans of the middle path, the middle way. You can never achieve anything beneficial in the world by being part of one extreme or the other. You always have to take the middle way in Buddhism, which is, when you think about it, it's like, oh yeah, everybody kind of nods their head, sure, that's obvious. But do we apply that to our understanding spiritual beings? We have to, because there's going to be beings of 2 opposite polarities. There's beings of tremendous light, but the light is blinding and it is distorting into stages of spiritual illusion, not necessarily direct perception of spiritual realities. The other side, more dark side, is of beings connected to matter that try to make us believe spirit doesn't even exist. Or if we believe it does exist, then try to get us to have forms of spirituality that basically become black magic. The manipulation of spiritual forces other people don't understand, so you can manipulate other people for your own pleasure or self-aggrandizement. So I have these 2 opposite polarities there. This is shown in the Christian tradition with the 2 thieves crucified either side of Christ. One inclines his head toward the Christ and says, take me with you into your Father's kingdom. And Christ says, you'll be with me in my Father's kingdom tonight. Other one turns his face away from the Christ and rebukes and reviles him. And again, there's 2 opposite polarities here. They're both thieves. And in fact, the thief that turns to the Christ is still accepting that he's done something of a detrimental nature. So all these things are playing out the same basic reality. Now, one of the only forms of modern spiritual teaching that really reached a large extent of people that has this clearly represented is the work of Rudolf Steiner. You don't find it that many other places. And Steiner makes this really clear. when he talks about these two opposing forces that he uses classical terms for. The unbalanced polarity toward the spiritual side is referred to as the Luciferic, because Lucifer means literally light bearer. And then the other side is referred to as Ahrimanic, because Ahriman, or Angra was the term for a dark being of the earth and materiality that pulled people's consciousness downward in the Persian Zoroastrian tradition. And it's important to understand that that concept of Ahriman, which you don't really see today outside of Zoroastrianism or Steiner, that concept after the Persian tradition became the concept of Set in the Egyptian tradition. And then as the Hebrews left Egypt and set up the Hebrew tradition, which became modern Judaism, that the concept of Set became Ha-Satan, and Ha-Satan means the adversary, which became our concept today of Satan. And so Lucifer and Satan were always understood classically as two extremely different, diametrically opposed spiritual beings and forces, and beings can be of either polarity. Now this is still understood by some people today. You can, for example, find Jesuits that will give public talks, and they clearly represent these as two completely different forces. But it's rare today. In most cases, certainly in Protestant Christianity, they completely mix them up into one thing. So it doesn't even make any sense anymore. How can Lucifer, this great being of light, be this dark sclerotic being in the earth with hellfire and all this sort of thing? Very different things that got mixed up here together. And it lost the capacity for differentiation. So now with people with the simple twofold dichotomy, very commonly will accept great beings of light that come as their guides and not differentiate out that actually they were being more of a Luciferic nature. And the thing is that it's a given on the spiritual path that both types of beings will be connecting to us and influencing us all the time. It's not like, oh, those other people out there. This happens to everybody. It's part of the system here that we're affected by all these beings all the time. The Luciferic beings give us all these great gifts, but also if we do nothing but follow their impulses, then you'll either become a heroin addict or you're going to end up with forms of spirituality that are completely illusory, and you're going to be unable to pay your taxes and get to work on time, and all these things that are not grounded, because they're constantly pulling your way. Or with the Ahrimanic beings, yeah, you'll pay your taxes, and yeah, you'll get to work on time, but you're going to lose real spirituality, and all your spiritual knowledge will go to manipulating other people. But these two opposed forces have to be distinguished from the beings of the center. That's the middle pillar in the Kabbalah. That's where the Christ is crucified in the image of Golgotha. That's where you have the middle path in Buddhism. But we have to have that minimum threefold differentiation to understand the beings that we're connecting with. When you start doing any spiritual path, one of the first beings that approach you strongly will always be Luciferic beings. We're all connected to Luciferic beings. And the first thing they're going to do is they're going to pump up your ego. And they're going to tell you, oh, now you're starting to remember. You're this incredible spiritual being. In fact, you're an incredible spiritual master. And blah, blah, blah. And they'll pump up your ego and get you all this ego inflation. And if you're not careful, they'll get you to think you're much more advanced than you really are. And then God knows where it goes from there. And it's not like, well, that just happens to those people. It happens to everybody. It's a particular challenge on the path that classically people knew that's one of the stages of the path. Today, nobody knows it anymore, so they think, oh, look at what's happened. So we have to have the ability to differentiate these two different types of forces. And the beings of the middle pillar are what we want to connect to. In the Rosicrucian tradition, or they're referred to as the Christic beings, because Christ is somewhat of the archetype of the middle pillar, connected to the Buddha in Buddhism, which is why you see the Vesika, the perfect balance between the two polarized circles, with the Buddha inside of it. In Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, also referred to as Michaelic beings, because Michael is the spiritual being referred to the most in the text of the three monotheistic traditions, other than God. And so that's a very high-level archangel with that particular force. But we want to put together this into a coherent understanding, because if you're going to be dealing with spiritual beings, these are like fundamental spiritual beings 101 kind of things we need to know, but aren't always taught clearly anymore. So these are the three levels of the spiritual discernment. Differentiate your conscious mind from your reactive self, where somebody's tone of voice can just trigger you to go into an unconscious trance state and act out in a detrimental way. Stage 2, differentiate your conscious mind from an impulse coming from the outside, which may be beneficial, but nonetheless we need to know is something coming from the outside rather than inside. And stage 3, what exactly is the type of being approaching us from the outside. Because it could be a hierarchical being, it could be a being of an elemental nature coming from hierarchical beings, or it could be a being of elemental nature that we generated or generated by another person. So this is very simple level differentiations we're talking about here.